Julian Vance believed the world was his kingdom, and his penthouse was the throne room. Perched 70 floors above the glittering city, it was less a home and more a monument to his own success. Walls of seamless glass offered a god's-eye view of the mortals below. Floors of imported Italian marble, so polished they reflected the cold, recessed lighting, stretched into cavernous living spaces furnished with minimalist pieces that cost more than most people's houses. The air itself was curated, filtered and scented with a faint, clean smell of ozone and money. It was a sterile paradise, a mausoleum of wealth, and Julian was its undisputed king. His queen, Eleanor, was more of a ghost. She moved through the vast, silent rooms with a quiet grace that rendered her nearly invisible. To Julian, she was his most beautiful asset, a masterwork of quiet elegance he had acquired along with his first billion. She was calm, intelligent, and impeccably dressed, the perfect accessory for a man of his stature. He had chosen her with the same ruthless precision he used to acquire subsidiary companies. Now, she was pregnant with his heir, the final jewel in the crown of his perfect life. He saw the gentle swell of her stomach as the fulfillment of a dynastic duty, another box checked on the long list of his achievements. Lately, however, a subtle dissonance had crept into the curated perfection of their lives. Julian returned home later and later, the faint, sterile scent of their apartment overpowered by a cloying, floral perfume that was not Eleanor's. His excuses were thin, papering over chasms of unaccounted-for time. "A late merger meeting," he would say, his voice clipped and dismissive as he loosened a silk tie. "You wouldn't understand the pressure." He spoke to her less and less, his gaze sliding past her as if she were just another piece of expensive, inanimate art. The condescension was a new cruelty, a slow-bleeding wound she tended to in the lonely silence after he fell asleep. The discovery did not come from a lipstick-stained collar or a whispered confession. It was colder, more corporate, and infinitely more wounding. One evening, Julian left his laptop open on the marble island in the kitchen, a rare oversight for a man who fetishized control. A notification blinked on the screen, an email from his star protégé, a sharp, ambitious young woman named Chloe. The subject line was Legacy. Eleanor's heart began a slow, painful thud against her ribs. Her hand trembled as she touched the trackpad. It was all there, a chain of messages that laid out the betrayal in brutal, transactional detail. They were not just lovers, they were conspirators. They spoke of Eleanor not as a wife or a person, but as an obstacle. "The legacy problem," Chloe had written. "We need to manage her exit strategy post-birth. She gets the trust fund, you get the heir, and we get the future." Julian's reply was a knife to Eleanor's soul. "Agreed. The asset will be liquidated. We can't have her lingering." A clean break. Asset. Liquidated. Legacy problem. The words echoed in the cavernous silence of the penthouse. The air, once just sterile, now felt suffocating, sucking the very breath from her lungs. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window, a pale, haunted figure against the city's indifferent lights. She saw the woman Julian saw, a temporary placeholder, a vessel for his heir, an entry on a balance sheet to be zeroed out. The initial shock was a physical blow, a wave of nausea and grief that threatened to pull her under. She clutched her stomach, a primal instinct to protect the one pure thing in this gilded cage. She could follow their script. She could be the weeping, discarded wife, the tragic figure clutching a settlement check as she was ushered out the service elevator of her own life. She could become the cliché they had written for her. She saw that future with horrifying clarity, a life of quiet, wealthy misery, forever defined by the man who had thrown her away. And then, another image rose to meet it, the face of her unborn child. She didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, but in that moment, she decided it was a daughter who would never, ever be made to feel like a liability. The grief, white-hot and searing, began to cool. It did not vanish, but rather transmuted, hardening into something else. It became a cold, clarifying rage. The shock subsided, replaced by a pure, hard resolve that felt like a rod of steel sliding into her spine. This was a strength she hadn't felt in years, a part of herself she had packed away and forgotten, like a dusty heirloom. It was the intellect her professors had marveled at, the strategic mind that saw patterns in chaos. Julian had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her gentleness for stupidity. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had started a war with a woman he did not even know. Her plan began to form, not as a complex schematic, but as a single, symbolic act. The annual Vance Foundation Gala was in 2 weeks. It was Julian's coronation, the one night of the year he played the benevolent king, surrounded by the city's elite, the media, and the titans of industry he so desperately emulated. He would be on stage, accepting an award for his philanthropy, basking in the glow of public adoration. That was his arena. That was where she would face him. She walked to her cavernous closet, past the rows of muted, Julian-approved beige and gray gowns, and found the one dress he had always hated. It was a vibrant, defiant crimson, a slash of color in a world of monochrome. It was the color of rage and the color of birth. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a galaxy of manufactured starlight. Diamonds glittered on necks and wrists, catching the light from colossal crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the low murmur of immense power and influence, a symphony of quiet boasts and backroom deals. At the center of it all, on a brightly lit stage, was Julian Vance. He was at the zenith of his power, accepting the Humanitarian of the Year award, a trophy he had essentially bought for himself through his foundation. He spoke of legacy, of building a better future, his voice smooth and confident as it resonated through the opulent room. He felt invincible, a modern-day king addressing his court. Then, the great oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, turning heads one by one until the entire room was focused on the entrance. There stood Eleanor. She was not the pale ghost of the penthouse. She was a vision of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. The crimson gown flowed around her, highlighting the proud curve of her pregnancy. Her hair was down, a dark cascade over her shoulders, and her eyes were not downcast but fixed, with an unnerving intensity, directly on the stage. She began to walk, her steps slow and deliberate, a queen approaching a traitor. The sea of tuxedos and ball gowns parted for her, as if by royal decree. The power in the room had shifted, tilting on its axis and sliding, inexorably, toward her. Julian faltered mid-sentence. His confident smile froze, then crumbled. He saw her, and in an instant, the triumphant glow of his evening was extinguished, replaced by a cold dread. Chloe, seated at his private table near the front, paled, her perfectly composed mask of adoration cracking. Eleanor didn't stop at the table. She walked directly to the small set of stairs leading to the stage and ascended them, her movements radiating an authority that silenced the entire ballroom. The low murmur died. The clinking of glasses ceased. There was only the sound of her heels on the stage. She stopped beside Julian, who looked small and stunned under the hot lights. She did not look at him. She turned to the audience, to the hundreds of powerful faces staring up at her in rapt confusion. She leaned toward the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was not loud or hysterical. It was calm, clear, and carried the weight of absolute truth. "Good evening," she said, the words cutting through the thick silence. "My husband speaks so eloquently about legacy," she paused, letting the word hang in the air. "It's a word he is very fond of. A word he used just last week in an email when he and his protégée, Miss Chloe Landon, were planning my future." A collective gasp swept the room. Chloe looked as if she had been struck. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "They decided," Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering, "that after I give birth to his heir, I would become a legacy problem, an asset to be liquidated." The clinical, corporate cruelty of the words landed like stones in the opulent hall. This was not a familiar domestic drama. This was a brutal, corporate execution made public. Then, Eleanor did something no one expected. Her calm broke, but not into tears. She reached behind the lectern, and her hand found a thick black cable snaking across the floor. With a single, sharp tug, she yanked the power cord for the massive projector from its socket. The giant screen behind Julian, which had been glowing with the proud Vance Dynamics logo, went instantly black. It was a symbolic detonation, a public execution of his corporate identity. The illusion of his power, his legacy, his carefully constructed image, All of it was plunged into darkness. Shatter. She placed the microphone gently back in its stand. Without a single glance at the humiliated man beside her or the horrified woman at the table below, she turned. She descended the stairs with the same regal composure with which she had arrived. The entire room, a collection of the most powerful people in the city, watched in stunned, breathless silence as she walked, head held high, out of the ballroom and out of Julian's life. The great oak doors closed behind her, leaving Julian alone on the stage, a fallen king in the ruins of his own coronation. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Before the last of the champagne was cleared away, the story of the Vance Gala detonation was already burning through the city's elite social circles. Gossip blogs exploded with the news, but it quickly bled into the mainstream business press. Julian Vance was no longer the visionary titan. He was a fool, a villain, a walking punchline. The story had everything: wealth, sex, betrayal, and a spectacular, public comeuppance. His carefully cultivated image was shattered beyond repair. The consequences in the boardroom were just as swift. A multi-billion-dollar merger he had spent a year negotiating with a conservative, family-run European conglomerate collapsed overnight. Their official statement was terse, citing the activation of a character and reputation clause in their agreement. The news sent Vance Dynamics stock into a freefall. Billions in market value were wiped out in a single trading day. Julian, once the master of his universe, could only watch as his empire began to crumble, the foundations rotted by his own hubris. It was then that the true viper struck. Marcus Thorne, Julian's trusted chief operating officer and the man he considered his right hand, saw his opportunity. He had been quietly resentful of Julian's arrogance for years, secretly plotting his own ascent. In the chaos of the scandal, Marcus leaked a series of carefully selected, damaging documents to a rival firm, making it appear as though Julian's recklessness extended to corporate governance. He portrayed Julian as an unstable liability. The board, panicked by the plunging stock price and public relations nightmare, called an emergency meeting. Marcus, playing the part of the reluctant savior, led the charge. Julian was voted out of his own company. Humiliated and exiled, he found himself utterly alone. Chloe, the catalyst for his downfall, had vanished, quickly aligning herself with the new power structure Marcus was building. Julian was a king in exile. He sold the cavernous penthouse, its sterile silence now a mocking testament to his failure. The endless glass walls felt like they were pressing in on him. He retreated to a small, forgotten apartment he still owned, a place he'd bought in his 20s before the billions had insulated him from the world. Stripped of his titles, his wife, his mistress, and his fortune, he was forced to confront the man in the mirror for the first time. There was no shield of wealth, no army of assistants, no adoring public to reflect his greatness back at him. There was only the hollow ache of regret and the terrifying, unfamiliar landscape of his own character. While Julian's world imploded, Eleanor's was being reborn. She retreated not to a place of luxury, but of authenticity. She went to her childhood home in the countryside, a rambling house with worn wooden floors and the scent of old books and dried lavender. It was a place of safety and sanity, far from the cold marble of her former life. Her best friend, Sarah, a fiercely loyal and pragmatic lawyer, was her anchor. There, surrounded by the quiet comfort of her past, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Thea, meaning goddess. The birth was not just the arrival of her daughter. It was the birth of her own new identity. Here, in the quiet of the countryside, Eleanor finally unleashed her secret weapon. Before she was Mrs. Julian Vance, she was Eleanor Reed, a prodigy-level software architect. Years ago, as a brilliant but naive coder, she had created the foundational operating system upon which Julian had built his entire empire. It was an elegant, revolutionary piece of code she had called Axiom. Julian, with his salesman's charm and ruthless ambition, had taken the credit, branding it, marketing it, and building Vance Dynamics on its back. He had convinced her to step away, to be his partner in life, not in business. Now, she realized he had simply sidelined the true source of his power. But she still had the original source code, the intricate knowledge of every line, every strength, and every hidden weakness. With a small inheritance her parents had left her and the legal guidance of Sarah, Eleanor started from scratch. She founded a new tech firm, calling it Phoenix Systems. The name was a promise to herself. From a makeshift office in her father's old study, she began to build. She didn't try to replicate Axiom. She set out to make it obsolete. She designed a new architecture, one built on the principles of transparency, security, and user-centric design. Everything Vance Dynamics was not. For 3 years, she worked with a singular, quiet focus. Phoenix Systems grew, attracting brilliant minds drawn to Eleanor's vision and calm, authoritative leadership. They grew from a small startup into a disruptive force in the tech industry, a David to the crumbling Goliath of Vance Dynamics. 3 years after the gala, Vance Dynamics was on the verge of collapse. Marcus Thorne's leadership had proven to be inept, and the company was hemorrhaging money and talent. Desperate, the board sought a buyer. A surprising offer emerged from a fast-rising, innovative company, Phoenix Systems. The bid was a lifeline, and the board eagerly accepted, scheduling a final merger meeting to formalize the acquisition. As a formality, they asked Julian Vance to attend. He was now a low-level consultant, a ghost haunting the industry he once ruled. They told him his knowledge of the company's foundational systems was required for the handover. He agreed, needing the paycheck, entirely unaware of who was behind Phoenix Systems. The boardroom was a place Julian once commanded. Now, he walked in as a humbled visitor, his suit well-worn, his posture stooped with the weight of his failures. He saw the grim-faced board members of his old company seated on one side of a long, polished table. On the other side were the executives from Phoenix Systems. At the head of the table, in the CEO's chair, a high-backed leather seat was turned away from him, facing the window. The new CEO of Vance Dynamics, Marcus's successor, cleared his throat. "Julian, thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce you to the CEO of Phoenix Systems, the new owner of this company." The chair at the head of the table slowly swiveled around. Julian's blood ran cold. It was Eleanor. She was not the wounded wife he had discarded, nor the avenging angel of the gala. This was a new woman entirely. Her hair was styled in a sharp, professional cut. She wore a tailored suit that spoke of quiet, unassailable power. Her eyes met his, not with rage or pity, but with the cool, appraising look of a chief executive examining an asset. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift. It was a tectonic plate of reality crashing into a new and permanent alignment. He was the supplicant. She was the queen on the throne. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice even and calm. "Please, have a seat. We have a lot to discuss." She was his boss. Months later, a new normal had settled. The merger was complete. Eleanor, as CEO, had purged the corrupt elements of Vance Dynamics and was slowly, methodically rebuilding it, integrating it into the ethical and innovative culture of Phoenix. She had offered Julian a position, not in management, but in a low-level coding department, working on integrating the legacy Axiom systems with her new architecture. It was a job he was uniquely qualified for, and a profound, daily lesson in humility. He took it. Their interactions were no longer colored by the past. He was an employee. She was his superior. But outside the office, a different, fragile dynamic was emerging. On weekends, he would drive to her modest, comfortable house in the suburbs, a world away from the cold penthouse. He came not as a husband, but as Thea's father. He would bring groceries. He fixed a leaky faucet in the kitchen. He would sit on the floor and play with their daughter, his face softening in a way Eleanor had never seen before. The silence between them was no longer accusatory. It was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of all that had been lost and all that was slowly, painstakingly, being rebuilt. One crisp autumn evening, as he was about to leave, he finally said the words she had once longed to hear, but no longer needed. "I was a fool, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet and raw. He wasn't looking at her, but at the small, colorful drawing by Thea that was taped to the refrigerator. "Not for losing the money. Not for losing the company. I was a fool for never seeing you. For having everything right in front of me and being too blind and arrogant to appreciate it. I don't expect you to ever forgive me. I want to be a man our daughter can be proud of. I want to earn back your respect." True power, Eleanor had learned, was not about control or domination. It was not about building empires of glass and steel. or having your name etched onto buildings. It was about resilience. It was about building a life on a foundation of your own worth, not someone else's validation. And redemption, Julian was learning, was not about reclaiming what you had lost, but about the quiet, daily work of becoming someone worthy of what you hoped to have. It was a long, difficult road, but for the first time in his life, he was finally walking in the right direction, guided by the light of the woman he had tried and failed to extinguish.